New Testament's the record of the life and the teachings of Jesus and the apostles. And because of this, it's a very significant set of documents, and the way that these documents were written becomes very important. The three main theories. There's a traditional theory, which is that the books of the New Testament were written either by apostles or by companions of apostles who had access to eyewitnesses. There are two other theories. These come from the 19th century, and they try to explain the Gospels in particular as later works written without eyewitness content. And in this video, we're going to look at these three theories, and we're going to look at the evidence that's used to support them. So subscribe, hit the like and the notify buttons, and off we go. So the New Testament is a compilation. It's a compilation of 27 books. 4 of them are the Gospels. They're the direct accounts of the work and the teaching of Jesus. Acts of the Apostles gives the movement of some of the apostles after the resurrection of Jesus. Got 13 letters, which are specifically named as having been written by the Apostle Paul. And we've got the letter to the Hebrews, which has no name at the start of it, but might have been written by the Apostle Paul. And then finally, we've got 7 letters from other apostles, known as the general letters, and a book of apocalyptic prophecy, which is called the Revelation. So 27 books altogether, and we have to look at different books slightly differently. So we'll begin with the Gospels, and we'll move on to other books later on. So one of the crucial things to think about is when these books were written. And we've got a time chart here. So down this end, we've got 30 AD. Up at this end, we've got 70 AD. And the ministry of Jesus and the resurrection I've put in, it's happening up to 30 AD. So about a 3.5-year ministry. The resurrection I've got in the spring of 30 AD. Of course, it was at Passover time. An alternative date might be 33 AD, but I'm going to carry on with the 30 AD because it's the weakest case that one might have for the authenticity of the Gospels. At the other end of the period, we have a war between the Jews, particularly the ones of Judea and Galilee, but Samaria was badly affected as well. Huge war between the Jewish occupants of those areas and the Roman legions. It lasted from 66 AD to 74 AD, and right in the middle of it, in 70 AD, Jerusalem was thoroughly destroyed, and the temple was destroyed with it. In fact, not just Jerusalem, but the war went out over the villages and towns of the area, and most of them were destroyed. And we've got another big event which marks the end of the New Testament period, and that's the fire of Rome in the reign of Nero. This made a massive change because before the fire of Rome, Christianity was considered eccentric but tolerated. After the fire of Rome, or fairly soon after that, Nero declared it was an illegal religion, and persecutions began, and Rome and Christianity didn't get on at all. There was massive persecution of Christians right up until the 4th century. So sometimes only a little bit, sometimes a big purge of Christians. Now, there are a few other dates, things like the accession of Gallio as governor in Corinth and things like that, which are mentioned in Acts, which let us put together a fairly tight chronology for the Apostle Paul and his doings. And there it is. So we've got 3 missionary journeys. We have a period of captivity first of all in Jerusalem, and then in Caesarea. And then he travels to Rome, and he spends 2 years in Rome. And that's where the Acts of the Apostles suddenly comes to an end. It's probably written then. We've got a period when he was probably at large again and went on another journey in the Aegean, and is probably back in prison at the end of that period, and he's probably killed in Nero's persecution. Some people think he escaped and went to Spain and then was arrested later on. but we have a framework for the chronology of the New Testament. So we can put Paul's letters, we can place them much more accurately than just in that bar. So at this end, we have Galatians. At that end, we've got 2 Timothy, and we can place all letters in that bar in between. The Acts of the Apostles, like I said, was written in 62 AD, right at the end of Paul's captivity in Rome. Within a month or two of the writing of Acts, he must have been released to go out onto further journeys. The general epistles, the general letters come, with the exception of James, after the fire of Rome. Things are changing there, and you can see that reflected in those letters. But they must have been written before the start of the Jewish War in 66 AD. The letter of James would have been written down here, something like 48 AD, almost certainly in that year. When we put the Gospels in, then, we can see how they fit with the letters. So Mark, for example, is alluded to in the letters to Corinth, 1 and 2 Corinthians, and in letters to Rome. So we can say, well, it must have been completed before 55 AD when those letters were written, and Peter isn't really available to talk to Mark, go on a journey with him until about 50 AD. So we've got a Mark somewhere between 50 and 55. John and Matthew must have been written before 70 AD because they refer to features that were destroyed in 70 AD as still being there. And as they don't have any hint of an ongoing war, they were probably written before 66 AD. John, you've only got 65 and 66. Matthew, well, Wenham puts him in down as early as 40 AD. To Mark earlier and Luke earlier as well. I would place Matthew after Luke, and Luke, of course, has to be written before Acts, and probably he's written while Luke, or the information for it is written while Luke is with Paul in Judea, able to talk to people who saw the things that Jesus did and said. So let's think about what that tells us. Well, the first letters are written in 40 AD, that's Galatians and James. And that means that if the resurrection's in 30 AD, they're written 18 years after the resurrection. So it's not a very big gap at all. It's well within living memory. There'd be lots of people who were around at the time of Jesus's ministry who would have been able to read Mark and comment on it, say whether, Galatians, to say whether they're right or not. And when it comes down to the earliest gospel, that's Mark 50 to 55 AD, then people will be able to comment on Mark, and there wouldn't just be a few people, there'd be lots of people. There'd be the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the ordinary people in the land, and as well as Christians who had followed Jesus during his ministry. So we've got plenty of checks on the earliest gospel, and even the latest gospel, which is probably John, written in 65 or 66 AD, there would be plenty of people around who could comment on it. And given the opposition between the Jews and the Christians, and between the Romans and the Christians, you would find that there would be a record of disagreement if John wasn't accurate or if Matthew wasn't accurate. There isn't any such thing. No one challenges the accuracy of the Gospels in the 2nd century, when the Gospels are definitely there, and we know that Jewish people were aware of them. So, who wrote the New Testament? Well, here are the traditional writers of the Gospels. Matthew's a disciple of Jesus. Mark, well, he's not there himself. He actually does appear in the Gospel. He's a rich man's son in Jerusalem, but he later on becomes a companion of Peter, and he gets his information from Peter, probably on a journey when he went with Peter as his interpreter. Luke was a companion of Paul. He was an educated man. He made an account of what Paul did, and he's in Jerusalem for a while with Paul, we know that. and he's got plenty of opportunity to find out what happened and to make an accurate record of what was going on. Because John was a disciple of Jesus right from the beginning of Jesus's ministry, and he's not just a fisherman. He's someone whose father owns a fishing firm, and John apparently trades in fish and goes to other cities to do the trading. Paul wrote the letters, or some of the letters. He's an apostle. He's called by Jesus, but called quite a bit later. He's a scholar. He also made tents. We've got Peter, who was a fisherman. We've got James and Judas. Judas wrote the book of Jude. They're brothers of Jesus. They're supposed to be craftsmen or carpenters. That's what the family did. And they become apostles later on. But again, they would know what Jesus was doing. But the whole point about it is that most of these are apostles. Mark and Luke aren't. They're companions of apostles, but they're all in a position to get very accurate information on what Jesus did and said. So let's think about the theories. How were the Gospels written? There are three theories. First theory is the traditional picture. That's that the evangelists, the people who wrote the Gospels, got them written so that they could preserve what Jesus did and said. And that would say these Gospels were circulated. The apostles circulated them. They were around. They said these are documents that are worth circulating. So we have apostolic authority behind them. That's the traditional picture. And the 19th century, people didn't like that. They had ideas that Jesus was different from the Jesus of the Gospels. And so they wanted to try and say, well, how would the Gospels be written if there were no eyewitnesses? How would that happen? And one of the theories is the idea there's a creative community which invented ideas of what Jesus might have done, which modified those accounts, which maybe took some authentic accounts and modified those. And these became oral ongoing traditions, and there's a certain amount of change going on. But after many years, the Gospels are written down. These traditions were collected by various writers, and we have the Gospels written down. And finally, there's a documentary theory, the idea that there were some documents created before the Gospels. There's either 2 documents or 4 documents, depending on the version of the theory, which are then become Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And there's a separate tradition which produces the Gospel of John. And that these early documents are compiled into the Gospels we have later on in the process. So do a diagram. So the traditional picture, you've got the ministry of Jesus, and that's observed by various people, the evangelists, the apostles, who see what Jesus did, hear what Jesus said. They follow his teachings, and they have to go out and teach these to various different congregations. But as the church grows, it becomes harder and harder to get around all the congregations, and after a while they write the message down so that people can have an accurate record of what Jesus did or said, to stop the oral tradition from getting out of hand. And the Gospels then become an authentic set of ideas of what Jesus did, a record of what Jesus did, that stops the speculations that might be going on in the church. And then those Gospels are copied and distributed and go throughout the whole church. That's the traditional picture. It's got evidence to support it. It's not things like underconcurrences in archaeology, the dating of the Gospels. It's got linguistic features, the way that the names are written in them. We'll have a look at that later on, but the evidence is there. Creative community theory, well, you've got Jesus starts the church off, and that's more or less all he does. 1 or 2 of the accounts of what Jesus said and did were carried on orally, and they're passed on to other people, and then other people would take those stories and they would not quite remember them correctly, or they would want to add a bit, or they would want to change it a little bit to fit their own circumstances, and gradually those accounts would be changed until in the end different people collect them. Mark collects one, Matthew collects another, John collects another, but none of these are apostles. They're not eyewitnesses themselves. And we end up with 4 Gospels, which are copied and distributed to the church. And again, it's interesting to say, well, what evidence that supports that? Were there accounts that talk about this creative community? Were there accounts which say the Gospels are written in that way? Well, there aren't. There's no reference to it. This is something that was invented as a sort of, well, this must have happened because it fits our idea of the development of Christianity by 19th century critics. The other one is the documentary hypothesis. Now, this is not compatible with the oral tradition hypothesis. The idea is that at some point, fairly early on, Mark's Gospel is written, and there's another document which is also written, maybe even earlier than Mark, maybe around the same time, and the scholars who decided this document might exist were Germans. They call it the source document. In German, the word for source is Quelle, so it was given the name Q. And then Matthew and Luke take stories from Mark and from this Q document and put them together to make the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. That's the 2-document version of it. The 4-document version, there are 2 other documents as well, one of which Luke has access to, and the other one Matthew has access to it, but they're otherwise unique. In the 2-document version, Luke and Matthew collect their own information for the other bits. It's not written in a document. Not much difference between the 2, really. The Gospel of John is written completely independently, and there's no account of how that was written in this theory. Interesting, though, if the Gospels are written when it seems they were written, and what we had in the chart before, then Q and Mark have to be very early documents indeed. They have to be written very close to the time of Jesus, and that means that they're liable to guarantee the reliability of what's in them. But when you look at it, actually, they start looking at the wording exactly, you find that while Matthew and Luke often refer to events that are also described in Mark, the way they describe them is frequently very different. I reckon about 1/3 of the words of Mark appear in Luke and Matthew, and that includes words like and the. So it's not a very high rate of similarity when you get the Greek text and put them next to each other. In the case of Q, it's even worse. Often the accounts are just a bit similar. So you get things like the parable of the pounds and the parable of the talents. They both have a similar point to them, but they're given on different occasions. The wording of the parables is totally different, and so on. So I'm exceptionally doubtful about the existence of a Q document. Anyway, these Gospels then are copied and distributed, and that's the New Testament we've got. But notice that the theory doesn't include any idea of how these documents connect to Jesus at all, whether they're just made up or whether they're actually accounts of what Jesus said and did. And again, supporting evidence, no supporting evidence. We don't have any picture of Q. No one wrote about Q. We don't have any copies of it. All we have is the Gospels that exist. So, evidence. Let's look at what the evidence is. Very briefly, because each of these has its own videos on Gospel Online if you look for them. So, evidence of archaeology. Well, the Gospels are interestingly accurate when they describe people, when they describe places, when they describe the customs that were going on at the time of Jesus. Particularly important, I think, are the places and the customs, because they are tiny details. And I've got an example, a description of the pool of Bethesda. There we go. In the Gospel of John, it says, there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. So it's got a detail. First of all, it says it's in Jerusalem, it's by the sheep gate, and then it says that it has 5 roofed colonnades. And there we go. There's an archaeologist reconstruction of it. They've dug it up. And there's what we are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 roofed colonnades around it, exactly as John describes it. And that's not the only place it describes. There are many, many other geographical locations described in the gospel, always accurately. And customs, things like the way that water jars in Judea and in Galilee were made of stone, whereas the pottery everywhere else, everyone knew about the pottery ones, but hardly anyone would know about the stone ones, kind of roof tile they used, and so on. All the customs are down there exactly accurately. So the picture in the Gospels exactly matches the time of Jesus and the place of Jesus. Now that's important, because remember, in 70 AD, Jerusalem was utterly destroyed. There's this war that goes on for 6 and a bit years, and which destroys practically everything. Even the people are taken away as captives, sold as slaves often by the Romans, and the people who come back and settle there don't have the same customs. They rebuild the buildings differently. They don't even speak the same language. What else we've got? Undesigned coincidences. Well, that happens when you get tiny insignificant details in the narrative which will match the insignificant details somewhere else in the same narrative or in a different narrative. And there's these hidden correspondences. Often you have to search for them. They don't stand out. The details are independent. They're not there as part of the same thing, and they fit together to produce a kind of sub-story that's independent of the main story that's being reported in whatever account we've got. So let's have an example. This is the bit just before Jesus delivers the parable of the sower. And then we are in the Gospel of Matthew, and it talks about Jesus going out of the house and sitting by the sea. And it's just a great crowd gathered around him. So he got into the boat and he sat down there, and that's where he teaches from, the crowd standing there on the beach. Now, this phrase, the house, in the Greek of the period, that would be talking about your home. So Matthew is saying, it's my house. So Jesus has been in Matthew's house. They go out of Matthew's house, and there they go down to the seaside, and Jesus sits down beside the sea, and the crowd gathers. There's the Mark account. And here we've got Jesus beginning to teach beside the sea, and the crowd gathers around him. Now, this is from Peter's point of view, as the accounts in Mark's gospel tend to be. And it doesn't have any mention of the house at all. Of course not. It's Matthew's house, not Peter's house. And so Peter, it seems, wasn't with Jesus and Matthew at the start of Matthew's account. He comes along later on. So maybe he's decided he's going to meet them down by the seaside, or maybe he sees a crowd gathering and thinks, oh, what's going on? And finds Jesus is at the front of it teaching. But it's the same occasion. The details are different, and you can put together this picture of Jesus being in Matthew's house and then walking down to the seashore, and Peter joining them there, which you wouldn't get by just looking at either one of the narratives on their own. Luke, who of course wasn't there at all, just gives the parable of the sower and doesn't explain the circumstances at all. So what we've got there is something that connects the writers with the actual Gospels themselves. And there are tons of other undesigned coincidences around. If you look for them, go to the website Bible Think, and you'll find a whole list of them. Linguistic fossils. Well, if you read a document which is written in a foreign language and translated, you often get constructions that come out of the original language. If you've got someone who says, I have to the horse over the fence some hay thrown, you can bet that originally they were thinking in German, for example. Well, the same thing happens in the New Testament. That was written in Greek, but you get words of Aramaic in there. Let's just go back a second. get words in there, things like on the cross, Jesus says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, Aramaic, my God, why have you forsaken me? He heals a girl who he addresses and says, Talitha Kumi, young lady, get up. You get the same thing in the phraseology, so it's not actually an Aramaic word in there. So here we've got one in Luke 9. Let these words sink into your ears. Well, no Greek ever wrote that. That's an Aramaic construction or idiom. There you go. Blessed are you when men shall hate you and separate you from their company and shall reproach you and cast out your name as evil. I had to quote that from the authorized version because it doesn't really come in English very much, and the other translations tend to say things like revile you, cast out your name as evil. It's a very much something that might have been said in first century Judea or in first century Galilee, but it's not something that would appear in Greek, and it's not something that would appear in English for that matter normally. So again, we've got this connection to the language that was being spoken in Judea and Galilee at the time of Jesus, whereas the Gospels are written for Greek readers. That's why they're written in Greek. If they'd been made up, then this kind of Aramaism, these Semitisms would have disappeared. So the fact of these Semitic fossils there places the origin of the words that are being reported in the Hebrew or the Aramaic community that Jesus belonged to at the time when Jesus was there teaching. Names, that's quite an interesting one. Names are things that are difficult to remember. Most of us can think of television programs or films that we've seen. We can remember the plot. We can tell people about them if we want to, but we can't remember the names of any of the characters. It's quite a common thing for me. And the fashions in naming children change. So if you look at the various different census records and see what people are called, you hardly get anyone called Algernon at all nowadays, but it was very fashionable in the 1920s, and so on. So from time to time, names change, the way that people call their children change, and it goes from place to place. So what people call in France is fairly different from what they get called in Britain, and even England and Wales have a different distribution of names from one another. So if you're going to name people, write something like the gospel and make it up, how do you get the names right? Well, it would be difficult for them at the time, but we've got the advantage because the Jewish scholar Tali Lan, Israeli scholar, has made a sort of directory of names from inscriptions, from gravestones, from literature of the time, from the New Testament as well, from all sorts of places, and you can see the distribution of names. So there we are, some of the most common ones. Most common of all is Simeon or Simon, and it goes on down, gets less and less common as it goes down. And in fact, that distribution is very well matched by what's in the New Testament. I've done a thorough statistical analysis of it, and I can confirm that the New Testament appears to be a random selection of names from that distribution, because of course they're not really random, but the people weren't selected for their names, they were selected for other qualities. So the fact that the distribution of names in the Gospels matches the distribution that the archaeologists and scholars have discovered shows that the Gospels match something in reality. It's the only way you could get like that at the time, because they couldn't do the kind of statistical tests that we can do now at the time. What's that tell us? Well, first of all these accurate points show that the Gospels are written when people could still remember what was going on in Judea. They're written during the lifetime of eyewitnesses, and in fact, they're written by people who were in contact with the area where Jesus worked and taught. So they were in contact with people who actually knew what Jesus did and said. So when it says Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, You could go to Bethany and you could ask people and they'd remember something like that. It wasn't going to be something that could be hidden away. So we can deduce that the Gospels contain accurate reports. There are plenty of witnesses who could say no, they weren't, if the reports weren't accurate. And the other point is that if the Gentile church had been changing the stories, making stories up, they wouldn't have had that kind of accuracy in them. So the traditional theory is supported by the information, whereas the oral tradition theory and the multiple documents theories aren't supported by any data. So what we're saying is that the people who wrote the Gospels had the motive to get it right. They wanted to preserve what Jesus said and did. They could do it. There were people around who were eyewitnesses, and they had the chance to write it down while the church was still developing, and they wanted to distribute the teachings of Jesus. We can take it that the Gospels are reliable records. So we've taken a look at the Gospels. In a moment, I'll go on and have a very brief look at the letters. But while you're getting ready for that, here's a question for you. Have I made a convincing case about the Gospels? Let me know what you think by writing in the comments, and I'll look at those later on, and if I can, I'll reply. So what about the letters? There we go. There's a list of the letters in the New Testament. We've got 13 letters there, which start off Paul an apostle, so they're claimed to be written by Paul. There's Hebrews, which doesn't start off with a name of a writer. In fact, formally it's anonymous. We've got apostles, other apostles who wrote letters. Starts with James, the earliest, and ends up there with Judas, known as Jude in English translations. Now, the critics don't like those. The critics identify some of these letters and say these letters weren't written by apostles at all. They were written later by somebody else pretending to be an apostle. Now, we have to be a bit careful about that. These happen to be the ones that say things that don't really agree with the Lutheran interpretation of the other ones. They tend to say, well, they can't be written by Paul because they don't teach what Paul normally taught. The trouble is that neither do the other ones with Paul. But nevertheless, you've got to think about it. What evidence is there that these letters were written by Paul the apostle or by the other apostles? Well, for me, the biggest thing is the way they fit into the narrative of Acts. So if you look at the dates of New Testament letters, you can work out when they were written, usually to within a month or two. Occasionally, it's to within a year or two, something like the letters of John, somewhere between 65 or 66 AD. But things like Galatians, you can say, well, it was early in the year, probably early March or late February, when Paul is setting off for the Council of Jerusalem. And you can identify Romans as being written at the end of Paul's stay in Achaia, in a particular part of the Acts narrative, and so on. And the way that they all fit together with one another and with Acts, to me, is something that you wouldn't be able to do if you were merely making it up. It takes a lot of work to see how they get together. And again, I'm not sure that would have been accessible to lots of different writers, each of them writing a different letter at the time of the New Testament. So the way that the letters fit into this pattern of the Acts of the Apostles suggests that these are an authentic set of letters written by the particular apostles. So the letters are written by the apostles themselves. Well, in that case, they contain the teaching of the apostles, because they actually are written by the apostles, so they contain their teaching. But interesting other thing is that even on the critical theories, at least some of those letters are written by the apostles. It's enough even in those to see what the teaching of Jesus was like and what it's about, because they're developing that teaching for the congregations to whom they are writing. So let's conclude the whole thing. So the Gospels we found were written either by eyewitness or people with access to eyewitnesses. And that means that they're accurate records of what Jesus said and what Jesus did. And the letters, they're written by apostles, and they contain the teaching of the apostles. So we know what the apostles were teaching, and that's teaching that they derived from Jesus, and which they were given by inspiration of God. These apostles, of course, were chosen by Jesus. These are chosen to preserve the teaching of the gospel and to tell other people about it. And basically, the conclusion we're coming up with is that the New Testament is actually a reliable set of books. If you want to know about Jesus, the place to go is the New Testament. If you want to know about the teaching of the apostles, go to the New Testament. That's where it's written down. Well, we hope you enjoyed that video. We hope you found it informative. If you did, please hit the like button for us. Leave any comments. Tell us what you thought about it. Want to argue with us, please do. Stick it in the comments and I'll get back to you as quick as I can. We release videos on similar topics every week, so look out for more videos, and try subscribing to the channel, and take a look at our website for more information. And may God bless you always.